Hello, this is Matthew Struck with WhyLibertarian, bringing you another interview of a absolutely fantastic libertarian that's with us. Before we get into it, just a really quick reminder, if you're watching this, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and please share this because it really helps to get the message out there as far as the background of people, how they come to the Libertarian Party, and why they vote Libertarian. So thank you in advance for that. So we are joined with Elliott Scheirman. Elliott, you were down in the great state of Texas, correct?
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me, Matthew.
Awesome. I thank you for taking the time. And remind everyone which congressional district you are running for office in right now.
I'm running in CD2, which is kind of a hook shape that circles the kind of northeast, northwest, and then almost down to into central Houston.
Awesome. And you know what was funny was I think this is right. When I was first kind of like doing my research before this interview, I remember looking at your district and just kind of thinking like, it's like the perfect example of the ridiculous way that we draw district lines. Would you kind of agree with that one?
Definitely. Gerrymandering is exactly the way to describe this district. If you look at some of the, in fact, the racial makeup of the demographics in the district, it is clearly heavily favored to have a majority of white people with a little sliver, just enough to disenfranchise them and not let them win an election of virtually everyone else. And it's, the Houston has several really, it's almost like spiral shapes as they come together. They are not drawn with any kind of prudent design. It's definitely political games.
Yeah, no, it was, if anyone wants to look it up, I wish I could pull up a picture. I came unprepared for class, but
we can drop a graphic in and post.
Yeah, we definitely could. I'll pull it up maybe and throw it up like in the corner. Yeah, so that is definitely a dynamic I noticed. The other dynamic is you're going up against pretty much a heavyweight on the Republican side, right?
Yes, sir. I'm running against incumbent Dan Crenshaw. He is infamous within the GOP for his, I guess he's really outspoken in support of President Trump, and they share a few things in that they both support red flag laws, which is something Republicans typically don't like. Republican voters, that is. The politicians seem to like it just fine. So there's a big disconnect, an opportunity for me to reach people who would otherwise not give me the time of day in this campaign.
Oh yeah, definitely. You know, in our conversation before we started rolling, you made a really good point. It's like, you know, you're really, your intent and most libertarians' intent is really to run on the issues, right? There's not too much tabloid that really creeps in unless they're trying to undermine the voice of the party, right?
Exactly. Most libertarians fall into that trap where they get thoroughly ignored by the media unless they trip up on one small thing, and then suddenly this is what the libertarians are, and it's like, oh, come on. Finding a gap is really easy to do. In 2016, the worst they had on Johnson was him not recognizing the conversation being about Aleppo. And that was all anyone could say about Johnson. It's like, have you even looked at his platform? No, the media said Aleppo, so that's it.
Yeah. I actually dropped a live earlier today that kind of talked to the most immediate election cycle and some of the stuff that gets talked about like that. And one of the take homes at the end was third parties get such little media coverage that like the R's and the D's, they get almost infinite opportunities to correct the mistakes, right? Or at least pivot away, right? Like, you know, the Wizard of Oz principle, like, you know, don't look at the man behind the curtain, like we're over here, like pay attention to this, right? So I was glad to see, and I'll definitely link this in the description below the video. I was glad to see you get involved in the virtual debate that you guys had, yourself, Dan, and I think her name is Seema, the Democrat who's running in your district.
Correct. It's definitely best to pronounce her first name because her last name is Lajvardian, and everyone I've heard butchers that when they're talking about it. So she does not benefit from the last name recognition as much, so she goes by Seema.
Yes, yeah, I don't blame her, and I that's like a pet peeve of mine where I really don't want to, you know, butcher someone's last name or first name for that matter. So, but yeah, so I was telling you before the recording, and again, I really hope people look at the recording of that debate, but the dynamic there in the debate couldn't have been more emblematic or a better example of how kind of the national dynamic is between the Republicans and the Democrats, and specifically the Libertarian Party. because they felt like they were just going to have this like, sibling spat where they were basically going to talk over you and sit there and kind of throw barbs at each other. And you kind of had like this, one moment where you're like, hold up, there's a third person in the room and I'm going to say something sensible, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, props to the Houston Chronicle editorial board for hosting that and including me. That was very classy and very professional of them to do so. So if they're watching this, thank you very much. But yeah, there was a solid 15 minutes of that hour-long debate where it was just them calling each other liars.
Yep.
And we were supposed to be the format was allowing 2-minute response times. And I realized around the 24-minute mark, I had only said my intro. And I was like, I'm a libertarian, so this is most people's first introduction to seeing a libertarian candidate. So I didn't want to come across as, as upset or whining or anything. So I just very firmly said, Dan, it's my turn to talk, and just talked over him until he kind of sat back in his chair.
Yep.
So it was nice to be able to, say my piece.
Let's talk about drug prices real quick, because
it's actually my turn to talk, Dan.
Yeah, I think you made some extremely succinct but eloquent arguments that really kind of threaded the needle and showed people the difference between the two sides and kind of the place, at least from a political ideology, where libertarianism sits between those two sides of the coin, so to speak. But so let me ask you about some specifics. So the reason why we're here is kind of talk about how you got to being a libertarian in the first place. I think one of the things that you had mentioned was basically anti-war, right? Like what year was it that you really kind of found the Libertarian Party, and was anti-war kind of that piece that brought you in initially?
Right. So I was relatively politically apathetic until I got out of college. Graduated in 2007, so that was right in time for the 2008 election cycle. And my parents had encouraged me to vote Republican in the 2004 election, and I didn't care, so I did. But this election, I was starting to have more of an awareness of the world, and I did care. And I was talking to a coworker, and there's like, who do you like for this election? I said, well, I can't vote for Republican. I'm sick of the wars. It's been going on too long. And again, this is 2008. So the wars that have been going on too long were 6 years in at that point. Here we are in 2020 talking about the same military, military activity over in the Middle East. We also need to end this endless war. The conflicts in the Middle East have been going on since 2002. That's 18. There are kids fighting right now over there who were born after this war started. That has absolutely got to stop. And I never was really drawn into the Democrat side, because I think that we actually need to have lower taxes, and we need to have more responsible spending, and we can't just throw government money at something anytime there's a problem. It's not a solution. It's just, all it does is either line the pockets of people who are politically well connected, or it just keeps it either keeps problems going on or creates new and inventive problems that are the source of the government. So I was just politically homeless, and he said, you kind of sound like a libertarian. And I told him, well, no, I'm not a liberal. And he said, no, libertarian. The root word is liberty. I was like, all right, I'm hearing you. Let me look into this. And I took a political quiz, and sure enough, that's exactly where I landed. So I like to say that I'm more of a Socratic method libertarian, where there were questions that I had and I wanted to get answers, and I kept pulling on that thread until I found this political home.
Yeah, I love that. I love that imagery. It also explains why a bunch of libertarians are kind of annoying, because that's what Socrates intended when he came up with the Socratic method, was basically win through just trying to find enough of the holes in your argument, right, in order to get to create a big gaping hole, at least when it comes to debating, right?
Exactly. Or just ask why until you get an answer.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing that I appreciate about being around other libertarians is just, libertarians aren't inherently headline readers, right? Libertarians are like researchers. And it really appeals to, you come from kind of like the energy sector, right? You're like a process manager. Is that kind of what you do, or an organizational manager?
Right. So I work in the oil and gas industry, which is very big in Houston, as you would imagine. Yep. And my background and my professional expertise is in supply chain project management. So that background has given me kind of the insight to successfully deliver on multi-billion-dollar projects and on time and on schedule. And that's, as I said earlier, that's something that the government is really bad at. And we could probably use some of that expertise in Congress.
I'm actually the only one in this race who has a career in the energy industry. So it's something that is near and dear to my heart. So I have a really good ability to balance practical solutions as well as concerns about the environment at large. We are facing a climate change challenge that is not something anybody can deny, and to do so is to just ignore the problem and hope that someone else has to deal with it. I'm concerned about the future generations of my family that don't exist yet, who are going to have to inherit this earth from us, and therefore we need to be responsible with how we take care of our home. So, as Congressman Crenshaw mentioned, natural gas is a good transition vehicle for that, but it's not going to be the only thing that's going to work. What we need to do is get regulations out of the way so that we can start having nuclear as an option. It's the safest, cleanest, most reliable source of energy that we're going to have to adopt going forward.
We've got enough lawyers. We've got enough, we've got enough people who have been working for the government their entire career. It's time for, diversity of the United States to be more represented in Congress.
Yeah. And that's a perfect example, kind of like what I was kind of like picking at was, libertarianism appeals a lot, not just to, but appeals a lot to people who are like scientists and engineers and mathematicians and things like that, because it is that process of kind of like digging and kind of that iterative process of like, okay, if we try this, would it work? And then the answer almost always when it's, should government do this? The answer is like, no, it's probably not going to work that well, right? But just continually trying to like proof. And the logical conclusion that we come back to is small government, right?
Exactly. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who is willing to straight up tell you, I think someone else can make better decisions for my life than I can. And when you really drill it down to that level and make it personal for them, instead of just, the government should help people because people need help. It's like, yeah, people need help, but do you think the government can better decide what you do with your daily life, where the money you earn goes? Do you think that some elected bureaucrat is better at making those decisions than you are? And most people will concede, no, I don't think that. I want to be able to live my life the way I want. But there's these other problems, so they need to deal with those. So,
right. Yeah. So that's an interesting path that you took. Now, when you were sitting there doing that analysis, were there other people at the time that you thought like kind of were saying the right things, and when you dug into it, because like 2008 is what? 2008 is kind of Ron Paul's.
Yeah, that was Ron Paul's second
heyday,
presidential run, first as a Republican.
Yep.
So this was right during the era and probably the biggest momentum that also started the fall off from the Republican Tea Party. They caught my attention with saying, you've been taxed enough. And then they lost it by saying, oh, by the way, the government should restrict what, gay marriage or, any number of other issues that just are kind of really an affront to personal liberty. So once they got co-opted by that faction, I lost all interest in the Tea Party and pretty much I did not have any faith. Ron Paul was kind of one little shining beacon. And in fact, I went as a delegate to the GOP convention in Texas in 2012 to get him nominated on his second presidential run so that he could actually be the nominee. And there was quite a schism between, I want to say, the people with gray hair and those without. We were sneered at. We were told our libertarians aren't welcome. And I was happy to believe them. So that was my last attempt at, dipping my toe in trying to work with the GOP. That was just about half of their platform is just something I completely disagree with. So I could not morally align myself with them. And then back to the anti-war stuff too. They were still going strong in 2008 and 2012. So not for me.
Yeah, one of the things I seek is consistency, right? Like anyone who says that they're principled, like a big component of that is consistent. Like when your principles are tested, that's when things really are, evident whether or not you have any kind of conviction, right? And that's one of the things that led me to libertarianism was, like you were talking about, like you don't hear very much from the Tea Party anymore because they were basically swallowed up on those kind of like religious social issues. and they almost completely diffused like the taxation and the deficit spending and the inflation, piece of it.
Exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
right now you have a Republican president who has achieved a higher score on deficit spending than any Democrat has ever in American history.
Yeah.
It's like it doesn't matter to them anymore. It only matters when there's a Democrat in power and they want to use that as something to criticize them.
Yeah.
The way a party acts when they are in power should tell you everything that you should know, that you need to know about them when they're campaigning and asking for your vote.
And to the other point of kind of the race you're in, and going head to head with Dan, um, I mean, where do you stand on executive orders, right? Because that was a big thing. Was a lot of Republicans were extremely skeptical of executive orders when it was Obama wielding the power, and now all of a sudden that it's President Trump and he's got an arm behind his name, there's crickets, right? Like they have absolutely no problem with him kind of doing things at a stroke of a pen.
Right. The only kind of executive orders I would support is when Joe Jorgensen wins the presidency and undoes all of the previous executive orders that were unconstitutional. And that's the only thing that makes sense, is to right a wrong, not to create new executive created legislation. That's just not how this country is supposed to work at all.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, being an anti-war person, would you believe the rhetoric that Trump is an anti-war president?
I've seen that a lot lately. People have been bragging about him with troop reductions. And if you look at the numbers, the troop levels are at the exact same place they were when he took office. So he put a bunch more people over there and then shifted them around a little bit, maybe brought some home, but the levels are the same. That's not anti-war. That's not it at all. If anything, he's covering up for how pro-war he's been over the last several years.
Yeah,
we're talking about a president just in, not even necessarily on the troop side, but when we're talking about drone bombs, he was killing so many innocent civilians that he instructed the military to stop counting bodies. Mm-hmm. He didn't want the bad numbers to keep showing up. So now there's and he was already on track to way outpace W and Obama after him. And now we just don't know what's happening. We have a government that is just operating in secrecy. And this is something that we deserve to know.
Yeah. I think that was also something that became evident to me, and I don't know if this was before your time or not, but if you remember back when we first went to Iraq, and the press was actually still semi unbiased, I guess I'll call it, they were asking George Bush, W, they were saying, well, what about these 5,000 innocent victims that we have that have been kind of killed in U.S. bombing strikes? And he laughed it off. And in that moment, I was like, I grew up in a family that was Republican, right? So it was all about, protect America and America first. And if we had to be proactive, then we were proactive. But just in that moment, I was like, the dehumanizing aspect of laughing at the fact that they were, now granted, look, war is war, right? Like there's going to be people that die that aren't necessarily holding a weapon, okay? But at the same time, you don't, not denigrate them, but you don't just write them off like that, right? I mean, that's basically a tenet of just being a responsible human. Not to mention the fact, I don't know if you're a person of faith, but typically if you're a person of faith, there's also an element of, religious respect that goes there, right?
Yeah, the biggest concerning aspect of that was, I believe it did start with under W's term, is that they declared every male over a certain age to be an enemy combatant after they had been killed by a drone.
Yeah.
So, hey, you were standing there and you got hit by our bomb. You must have been guilty. That's the opposite of justice, and that left such a bad taste in my mouth. That was why I really could not get behind. Becoming a Republican, like the household I was raised in. So that's that's something that's not a compromise for me. We should not ever engage in any kind of military conflict unless, one, there's an actual declaration of war, and two, that declaration of war is based on a legitimate threat against the United States and the people who live here. We don't need to be operating $1 billion of spending every year just to police the globe. We don't need to be subsidizing Europe or Asia or Africa's, self-defense. We're American taxpayers, and we are $27 trillion in debt. We need to tighten our belt a little bit as a government.
Yeah, most definitely. I think I think this goes without saying, but I'm pretty sure if you were to win this race, if and when you win this race, and you get into Congress, you would be behind any bill that cut spending, right?
Well, if
strategically,
any single issue bill that cuts spending, yes. Well, unfortunately, right now the Congress, they operate on manipulations, and there's all sorts of little riders and poison pills and all sorts of other things that they use just so they can score political points against the other party and say, oh, they voted against this. And I would be one of the few who would actually read legislation before voting on it instead of just taking a glance at the summary on top. Like you said, I'm going to go ahead and analyze and read the details and see what I'm getting behind in order to support it.
Yeah.
For example, you might have something in there like cut taxes. Oh, and also complete the Mexico border wall or something like that. And I wouldn't. Yeah, that would be painful to vote against, but I would not vote for any silly boondoggles like that would cut taxes and throw us further into debt. For example.
I think anyone who watches this, I'm going to double down on your message. The fact that they have bills that the main title of the bill isn't the full scope of what it's actually doing. They're basically tacking riders onto it. It is manipulation at its worst, right? Like you said, they tack the riders on, and it's basically a payoff scheme, right? Like they're basically buying votes on the main bill by tacking stuff on the tail end. And then it's like a win-win. They get the bill passed, and then they also get to campaign off of the individual voting or not voting for the bill based off of that stuff that gets tacked on. It's like it's the ultimate misinformation campaign or like sleight of hand that happens in the policy process.
Yeah, one of the most egregious examples of that is very recently, and this is something I've called my opponent out on, is the 2020 NDAA, which allows ongoing military spending. They slipped in a rider there that allowed the government to target U.S. military veterans for red flag laws. I can't imagine a worse way to treat the people who have served this country. And of course, Crenshaw voted yes on this. So this is a guy who's already had a dubious stance on gun rights, and you'd think as a veteran he would have at least that demographic that he would at least look out for them.
Yeah. I think sometimes libertarians get painted into a corner by saying that like we have these kind of like broad things that we say, and one of the broad things that we say are there's not very much different between Republicans and Democrats, right? And if you're down that rabbit hole, you're like, that's preposterous. Like they think this and we think this, but really we come at it from a more pure standpoint, right? And to your point, how can you be someone who sits there and touts personal freedom and liberty, and then you sign off on something like the Patriot Act or NDAA that is the complete antithesis to that, where you're like, you know what, you can be personally free unless the state thinks you're a problem, and then we get to do whatever we want, basically. That's a huge like logical fallacy.
That makes me want to see if we can push this push that we're doing right now for ending qualified immunity to hold law enforcement more accountable. I wonder if we could push for that to apply to legislators as well, who pledge an oath to uphold the Constitution and then immediately violate it with their legislation. I wonder if we could pull a thread there and see what we could get going.
That's like.
Yes. So as I mentioned earlier, I mean, I grew up watching the local system fail people of color in a very real way that I experienced and saw. When it comes to systemic racism, this is an absolute problem, but it's not just the systemic racism that's the problem. It's the fact that there are some members of law enforcement who are completely unaccountable for their criminal actions and the way that they interact with citizens. And Representative Justin Amash introduced a bill about 120 days ago called the Ending Qualified Immunity Act, and that has the first tripartisan support bill in Congress. One lone Republican got on that because apparently, holding people accountable is not something they actually believe in. What we need to do, like that would end the protests and the resulting riots overnight.
That statement, there's like so much to unpack there because there's like 15 things I could say about that. The one I would ask you about is, okay, so you mentioned qualified immunity. Obviously, the racial equality and equity conversation that we're having as a nation right now, or I would argue the conversation that we're not having because it's just people yelling at each other. Qualified immunity, I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with just the concept. I don't think it was necessarily in the national, main kind of point of view until really recently. Not many people knew what QI was. From that standpoint, my understanding, and I would love to hear your opinion on this, is that it's basically case law. It's not codified anywhere, right? It's essentially something where a bunch of judges said, well, look, we don't want to be overly strict because we might overreach. So it basically gives carte blanche to law enforcement officers. Is that your understanding of where we're at with it?
Right. And over the last several years, and maybe even decade at this point, actually several decades, because I can think of several going back to the 90s, anytime there was a case where a police officer crossed the line when it came to doing their job with law enforcement, they got a paid vacation. Take 2 weeks off. We're going to look into this. We're going to investigate it ourselves. And, we lost the evidence chain, or, this is probably fine. They were just doing this. And this is allowed because this law that we are referencing right here says it's okay.
Right.
And it really created a situation where there was an imbalance in justice.
Right.
You have people who are supposed to be neighborhood servants and keeping the peace, and they have crossed the line in some cases. And I'm not talking about everyone. I'm talking about some specific cases where people end up being abused or beaten or shot or
right.
worse. Or there might be situations where they have drugs planted on them to justify a profiling stop after the fact. Whatever the case may be, anytime there's something like that happens, the person who is crossing that line as a police officer while they're wearing that badge, they are committing a crime. And if an individual citizen were doing that same thing, they would be held to a totally different standard. So just because you have a shiny badge and a gun on your hip, it doesn't mean that you are allowed to be a criminal enforced by the government.
Now, let me play devil's advocate. Most people would say that taking that tact is anti-police, okay? Kind of connect the dots for me. Why is that not necessarily anti-police?
Well, if you have a situation where police are held accountable when they do mess up and where good cops are rewarded instead of punished when they call out wrongdoing when they see it, you build trust with the neighborhoods that you're operating in. Nobody's going to call, I hate to say this, but nobody wrote a song called Fuck the Firefighters.
Yeah, that's true.
People trust firefighters to show up when they need their help, and they don't get in their business when they're not.
Right.
So if we adopted more of a situation where police didn't have such a systemically antagonistic approach to the neighborhoods in which they work and operate, I think that there would be a lot more trust and support from everybody in the community, not just the people out in the suburbs who are wearing, who have those flags with the blue stripe across them.
Yeah. And I would also make the point, I think those are fantastic points. I would also make the point that it would make their job easier, because there are tons of neighborhoods in this country where folks are afraid to speak to the police, despite the fact that they know that there's criminal activity or things like that going on. Because the only group that they're more afraid of than the gang or the criminal actors that they know are in the neighborhood is probably the police department. And that's a problem, right?
It is a problem. Something I do want to kind of clarify, though, is I'm not talking about individual cops with bad judgment. I'm talking about, we have serious systemic issues where their leadership is telling them to go patrol certain neighborhoods because of their racial makeup. These are the instructions they're receiving from their command structure. There are 3 different groups of people right now that I would say fit into that group, that description you gave about too afraid to go to the cops when there is criminal wrongdoing. And I feel like a libertarian approach to our justice system would help solve all 3. The first one is going to be anybody in any way related to the drug trade. If we end the failed war on drugs, you get rid of all the black market cartel operations, all the gang distribution activity. It's just, there's simply no reason for it to be there if you can go to the corner store and buy a pack of Marlboro marijuana. And it's so once you remove the criminal incentive to operate in that area, and there are crimes or wrongdoings, people can come forward without fear of anything because they're not doing something illegal that they can themselves be thrown in prison for.
What we also need to do is end the failed war on drugs. That gives so many options for police to just start conflicts with people where they otherwise wouldn't. It gives them the ability to profile. Hey, I smelled weed. Let me pull you over and put some bullets into you. That's not okay. We could adopt the Portugal method, where they decriminalized everything and started treating drug addiction as a medical issue instead of as a criminal one. That would also help out issues like human trafficking, where the victims are so afraid to come forward because they might be tied to some other victimless act that is currently a crime. So much can be solved. Law enforcement could be redirected to solving crime, to preventing violent acts, to solving crimes like theft and murder and rape. Instead, they're spending all of this time. 80% of the prisons right now are full of people for drug offenses. And that's just completely wrong. It gives too much of a reason for a conflict to occur.
Not to mention the fact that, I know you got two more coming, not to mention the fact that there's also human and sex trafficking that goes along with that supply chain as well.
You took my thunder there. The
next sorry.
thing I talked about was legalizing sex work. Right now, there's a big, ugly pipeline of trafficking that goes along with sex work, because right now, with prostitution being illegal, you have people who break the laws running all of the operations. And
right.
There is legitimately a demand for people who want to patronize sex workers, and that's not something that you could legislate away.
Right.
And in places like Nevada, where it's legal to operate a brothel, you have people that go to those brothels. If you want to make any money as a sex worker and you want the safety and security of that, you'll go and work in a brothel instead of on a street in a way that is illicit.
Right.
So that's the second kind of group of people who, if there is abuse and they see it, they really have to weigh whether or not they want to lose their way to make money and possibly their own freedom to report a crime. So most of the times they have to keep their mouths shut out of self-preservation.
And also, one of the groups that is the most frequent perpetrators of violence against sex workers isn't just the Johns, right? It's actually police officers that are some of these bad actors that get involved really deep within kind of the ecosystem that's out there. So that's another thing to point out in that.
Right.
Right.
And
I cut you off again.
when it's your job to enforce people to not do victimless acts, you create victims by enforcing that. And that's not the fault of individual police officers. It's the fault of the system under which they operate.
That's a really good point.
The third group that I really want to talk about is immigrants.
Another topic that was totally bypassed today is our horrific caging of children immigration policy. We need to get rid of that on day one. We need to stop separating children from their families just for people trying to come here to find work, to follow the American dream. We need to let people have a streamlined immigration process and get the government out of the way.
And you have hardworking people who are literally embodying the American dream, who come to this country, some legally, some illegally, and a lot of them get targeted just the same by law enforcement, who thinks that their attempt to carve out that little slice of the American dream and put food on the table for their families, they think that that's a horrific act that violence needs to be used against to stop it. And as a result, trafficking, human trafficking across the border, you're not going to get people speaking up about it if they're terrified that they're going to be sent away. Yep. And it breaks my heart when you talk about that stuff, because these are people who are good, decent people who are hardworking. And, obviously you're going to have outliers who are criminals, and they should be held to the same criminal laws that Americans are held to. So I'm not saying, get away with letting people be violent here as immigrants or as domestic residents. But that's a whole group of people who are silent and have an antagonistic approach to the police. And it's something that's not caused by the police. Again, this is caused by the system under which they're operating. And we have to fix that if we're going to have a more human way that these government employees interact with the people they're supposed to be serving.
Yeah, 100%. And that's, I think that's the other problem of politics nowadays is everyone's looking for this soundbite or this solution to a single problem. And that's just not the way it works, right? Like there's no magic solution to any one of these issues. They're all interconnected. So what you really need to do is you have to vote for a frame of reference or a perspective or a philosophy. You can't just vote for someone who's over here on this issue and over here on this issue and over here on this issue, because at the end of the day, even if they're like slightly, making a difference in one of those areas, they could also cause more damage than you started off with, because they could create an imbalance or a problem somewhere else within the system without appreciating that. So let's talk to the idea of drug legalization and say like legalizing sex work. All right. most people would sit there and say, I can't vote Libertarian because they want a bunch of druggies hanging out on the street, and they want a bunch of hookers hanging out on the street right next to them, and like the nice, quaint America that we've built is just going to be destroyed by debauchery and drug use. What would you say to someone who is kind of looking at libertarianism, and that's one of those fringe things where they're like, I don't know, I'm kind of distancing myself from them?
Right. I mean, I think right now you can point to examples where people are upset because there are bars or there are strip clubs in their neighborhood, and you can say, look, they contain it in there for the most part, though people who don't are punished. For example, if there are people who are drunk driving and they hurt others, they are committing a crime, and that's not something that's allowed just because drinking is legal.
Right.
So you can also look at examples like the country of Portugal. They decriminalized all drugs, not just marijuana, but everything. That doesn't mean you can go and buy it in the stores per se, but it does mean if you have an addiction or you have a problem with it, it's treated as a medical issue, not a criminal one. In fact, when they decriminalized drugs, most people expected Portugal to, go down into the dumpster. But as a matter of fact, overall drug use went down, teenage drug use went down, addiction went down. The amount of spending that they had to allocate previously towards fighting the drug war that they were having, they spend a fraction of that now just on medical facilities for treatment centers for people who have legitimate addiction issues.
Right.
And less taxes, less crime, less drug use overall, less teen use. I mean, these are all positives. Yeah. And if and look at how many states in the U.S. have already legalized recreational marijuana. We don't even have to talk about medicinal, but recreational. These states have more money than they know what to do with coming in, because since it's still Schedule 1 drug at the federal level, and I think this has changed recently, but for the longest time they weren't able to even deposit money into banks that were FDIC insured. So they had all this money that they didn't know what to do with, and a lot of them smartly redirected that money towards infrastructure and education. And these are all things that the non-drug I'd say the non-drug advocates can get behind, because they're saying, okay, at least if it's going to exist, at least let it go pay towards something positive. And the same thing with sex work. Again, looking at Europe, they've got places where it's legal, and that's the zone where you can go and make use of that. And those who don't want to be around it can avoid it. So yeah. It really just comes down to whether or not you are willing to see a violent black market emerge as a response to the government making something illegal. And if you want to see that violence in your community, most people, when you put it that way, they don't want to see gang violence. They think that they associate that stuff with the drugs or the sex workers because it is illegal.
Yeah. And what's funny is they can't, or it's not funny, it's tragic, but they can't separate. They think that drug culture is like just part of gang culture. The only reason why drug culture is a part of gang culture or even part of organized crime is because it creates a revenue stream, right? Mm-hmm. That's how they fund their operations. I think the other thing that gets missed in both of those conversations, and I think you're on board with this, is this kind of like law of unintended consequences, where when you outlaw something, you're basically also outlawing the positives that could come from it. Okay, so we're already seeing with CBD and THC research that there are applications for that. We already know that there are potential applications for things like LSD and other types of compounds that are out there that you're not allowed to do that research on because it's illegal. And then the last point would be in that vein, like on the sex work side, it's not all just kind of recreational that's being done. There's sex therapists and sex surrogates that fulfill more of a therapeutic, component to that industry that, if they're operating right now, they're operating basically outside the bounds of the law, and they fall victim to the same exact problems that, someone who is more of kind of a recreational sex worker is kind of engaging in or they run into. So no, I think those are fantastic points.
It's interesting that you mentioned sex therapy. That's not even something I'd even considered. But yeah, the market is capable of figuring out all sorts of different ways to utilize goods and services that people demand. Something I wonder is if sex work were legalized nationwide, would we still have all of these angry throngs of people who get together and just they join these hate groups and threaten other either racial or or gender minorities. I don't think so. I think these guys just need to get laid.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll also throw in there the dynamic of social media and how so many, at least the perception is that there's so many more like shut-ins and people that do not have the machismo to go out there and like find partners, right? I mean, that kind of fills that need, doesn't it? Like you don't necessarily have to be the most charismatic person in the entire world in order to engage in that. So
and I don't want to knock anybody who enjoys the use of sex workers. It's not anything to be ashamed of if that's something that you enjoy doing.
It's true.
I could definitely see maybe a little bit less rage in our society if people were able to use them more regularly.
Yeah. Not to mention the fact that let me pull out the hypocrisy of the people that are so anti these things. Like what's funny is the people that are usually the most vocally anti something, a lot of times you end up finding out that they're the ones that are actually engaging in it in the first place, and their anti position is like some form of hatred, right?
Mm-hmm.
So up here, or self-hatred. So up here in New York and New Jersey, I mean, this is Elliott Spitzer territory up here, right?
You really did a lot of damage to us Elliots and our good name.
Yeah, I know. Like that's like good thing you're not named Kyle nowadays. I mean, that's just that would be awful. But yeah, no, I think all you have to do is look for kind of that trend of folks that are so like anti or pro criminalizing something, and then you come to find out that they're actually engaging in the same exact activity that they're anti or they're criminalizing. I think that just speaks to the point where prohibition does not work. It just doesn't. Like there is no, I can't remember a time in history where outright prohibition did not result in huge amounts of fallout from, creating a black market, and then the human fallout of, just look back to the early 1900s and the 1920s, right? I mean, bathtub gin was not exactly the most high quality product that could have been out there on the market.
And I don't know I'm sure you've heard this anecdote, but during Prohibition, the government would actually go and poison booze that they would find to punish the people who were drinking it illegally. It's like they had possession of it, and then they distributed poisoned booze just to try to get people to not like booze anymore. And that's such a reckless approach to dealing with a perceived societal ill.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really speaks to the authoritarian nature of just government in general. So many people right now are pointing the finger, and they're trying to say that, like, this person's a fascist, and Trump is a fascist, and he's authoritarian, and they're authoritarian. Well, I've got a news flash for them. Most people who think government is the first stop and not the last one, they're authoritarian. It doesn't matter whether they have a red, a D, they're red, they're blue. Doesn't matter, right? And so, that kind of dynamic, I appreciate that you're running in a tough race in order to try and fight back that narrative, and to kind of bring some sense to it. So
this race in particular, it took a lot of courage to stand up and run in. I mean, I know how popular this guy is, and Houston area is always going to put up a solid Democrat as well. But I got so sick of not having good candidates to vote for. The Libertarian Party fields fantastic candidates, but we're not in every single race, unfortunately. I think the entirety of Houston and in our congressional races are covered. We have a candidate in every single one in the Houston area. But can you imagine just how disappointing it would be to be a Libertarian or to just be sick of Crenshaw's junk and not be able to vote against him because you really hate Democrats? That would just not, or on the other side, be sick of the Democrat hypocrisy and how they haven't talked about ending wars since the Clinton administration.
Yeah. Well, no, Obama was supposed to be the anti-war president, wasn't he?
He certainly was. He was sold that way. Obama was an interesting case because he seemed like an actual agent of change, and he was going to come in and make some social improvements that were drastically needed. But that means he got a pass on every awful thing he did. The Democrats did not hold him accountable at all when he did very anti-Democrat party platform things.
Yeah. Now let me give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt in asking this question. How much of, and I definitely don't want to keep you for too long because
we're good.
You have stuff to do. But so what would you make of someone who said that, look, he came in with really good ideas and just the machine of DC chewed him up? Would you think that there was any kind of weight to that?
I would say that that is extremely likely for people who aren't grounded in a very principled approach to governance. I think if you listen to the people, who put this image in your head of this is all you can do, we've laid a path out for you, but you have to do what we say, which is, I think, what the case with Dan Crenshaw is, that you just kind of sway with the wind and go whichever way they tell you to go, vote for whatever you vote for. And that's why it's so easy to find examples of hypocrisy in his speeches and voting records. Myself getting elected, I would be in a position where I would say no a hell of a lot of times in DC. On the other hand, people would come to respect that consistency, and I would be able to caucus on an issue by issue basis with Republicans and Democrats, depending on what it is. So that's an advantage that people, if you are trustworthy and reliable, people are going to pick up on that, even if they don't agree with you on a certain issue. And I've had people who are dyed-in-the-wool, hardcore liberals who have said, "I am the biggest socialist you've ever met, but I respect that you are very consistently anti-war, that you oppose Republican attempts to encourage discrimination against the LGBT community," and that sort of thing. And that respect is where you can work with them. Here sorry if I'm rambling, but here in Texas, we have this multi-party coalition to legalize marijuana. Right now, the only thing stopping legal marijuana is the Texas legislature. The state has 70% support for legal marijuana in Texas. And that hasn't just happened as an accident. Libertarians have worked with Greens, Democrats, Republicans, independents, individual advocacy groups alike across the state. And we speak every 2 years when the Texas legislature is in session. And sorry, I'm getting on a Texas local thing right now, but I'm an activist, and that's where I come from. So it's really exciting to see that you can work together across different aisles and different walks of life if you have a common goal and an issue that unites you.
So do you think it's defiance that, not wanting to say that you had a position contra to that, and now that you're changing? Like, do you think it's defiance? Do you think it's strictly on a moral basis that, the legislature is not kind of siding with this mass, support for this? Or, is there some other element there that's at work that kind of stops them?
It's 100% at this point, with this much voter popularity going against it. It's 100% lobbyist influence. And in Texas especially, you've got all of the moneyed interests that don't want marijuana legal. You've got the prison industry. You've got alcoholic beverages and sales. You've got pharmaceuticals. Marijuana legalization is a threat to all three of those, and those are enormous donors, to the politicians who run here.
Yeah, what's really tough I've found about politics is, there's almost never a smoking gun, right? In some of the worst cases of, say, like, fraud or buying votes for, this or that, some cases there is, but more often than not, there's not really a smoking gun. There's no check that says, vote for this on it, right? And so that's always really difficult, because I think Americans know that the money in politics really kind of dictates the direction of politics. The problem is, I don't think that there's any way to concretely nail down the extent to what it is, right? Like, is it just at the margin in order to push it over the edge, or is everyone on the take, right? I think me personally, I think it's somewhere in the middle. Like, I don't live at the extremes. I think there's something in the middle that's the truth. But it's really difficult to really kind of communicate to the masses that, look, part of the reason why the Libertarian Party has such a difficult time is because there's not going to be too many industries that are lining up to, line our campaign coffers to run, right? Like, there's not too many of them.
We're the most pro-business party in the entire country. You'd think that they would.
But we're pro-free business. We're not pro, government-assisted monopoly. That's the problem.
We appeal a lot to small business owners because they don't get to write legislation and lobby the government to make rules that favor large corporations. They're the ones who are usually stamped out by large corporations who do that to them. Yep. So you'd be surprised. I'm not sure what the makeup is there in your area, but we have so many small business owners that are involved in the Libertarian Party because some event happened that just wronged them into the point where they're so mad that they're like, I'm done with this.
Yep.
And you see that in manifest in a lot of different ways. I'm not sure if you've if you've heard that killdozer story, but I try to avoid people going to those extremes, and hopefully we can find legislative solutions to situations where the government just completely wrongs you and there's no recourse that you can figure out because they make the rules.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what, the other thing that not just the Libertarian Party, but third parties and outside parties in general bring to the conversation is there's some truth that is being completely hidden from the electorate. One of those things being, and this is a big sticking point for me, I'm glad to hear that you have a lot of small businesses involved in the Libertarian Party. It's not like that in New Jersey. New Jersey is so dominated by Democrats that what's really tough, it's like a go along to get along kind of thing, right? Like, you're a small business owner, you feel like there's no alternative, and it's such an avalanche to try and get past that you really feel like you're just kind of stuck, like you're almost being extorted in a way. But small business is the lifeblood. Entrepreneurship and small business is the lifeblood of our economy. The problem is that we've fallen into this path where I would say probably since Clinton, Bill Clinton, that all of a sudden all of the focus is on bigger business, right? It's the Fortune 500, it's the Fortune 1000 that basically dictate economic decisions. And that's a huge mistake, right? Because you basically have anti-competition, you have high regulation, going back to the racial equality conversation, the lack of the prospects of entrepreneurship and small business and being able to better yourself through like just being hustling, that helps poorer folks in the community. It gives them upward mobility within the income, strands. And no one's talking about that, or at least no one outside of the Libertarian Party is talking about that. Exactly. Because, they have all these ulterior interests that are basically dictating their policies.
Yeah. And that's one thing I really have come to appreciate is how far ahead of the curve we've been on important social improvements. When you talk about, gay marriage, legalizing drugs, ending wars and stuff, this is something that has always been part of our platform since the beginning in the early 70s. And when you talk about empowering people in their own communities to be able to start businesses without huge barriers to entry or without getting permission from the government via licenses and this stuff, and allow people to just serve their fellow person and make a profitable living off of that so that they can feed their families. Once again, you have people who aren't relying on the government and who actually have a stake in making sure that their freedom is preserved. So the more time, the more people have the opportunity to explore these, these small business endeavors, the more freedom they can have and want to have, and they are concerned about preserving.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's like a mic drop moment. I think I'm gonna let you go on that one. I don't think I can do anything better than that statement. If people want to find out about you, if they're in your district or even if they're not, and they just kind of want to look you up because, look, let's face it, you're an awesome voice for the Libertarian Party. Where can they find information about you?
Well, first of all, thanks for saying that. One thing that's really guided this campaign is I want to set a good example for not just libertarians to inspire them to run and to run good, aggressive, competitive races, but also so that people who aren't libertarians will sit up and take notice and realize that we're a serious party and that we offer serious solutions as well. If you want to follow me, my website is scheirmanforcongress.com. I'm going to spell it out for you because my name is easy to pronounce but hard to spell. It's SCHEIRMAN. And again, that's scheirmanforcongress.com. I've got an active following on both Facebook and Twitter. On Facebook, you can reach me at Scheirman for Congress. And on Twitter, you can reach me at Vote Scheirman. There's also an Instagram with a little bit of activity on there under Scheirman for Congress.
Awesome. Look, I wish you the best. I'm hoping that you're David that can slay Goliath this November 3rd. And look, I appreciate you taking the time. This has been awesome. Thanks, Elliott.
Thanks so much for having me, Matthew. Really appreciate it.
Have a good one.
You too.